All right, for those songs this evening, we're going to be going to Exodus chapter 12. Hopefully, everyone got a handout for reference. It makes some sort of sense. That was kind of a last minute decision to print those out. I was just going to explain some things off there and just thought it might be a little easier to follow if you had something to look at. And so that's just the story with that. Exodus chapter 12, we'll look at verses 1 to 28. We're still in our series on study of Bible doctrine, and this is message number 62. And the title is Churches and the Feasts of Israel. So, Exodus chapter 12, beginning here at verse number 1. And the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Speak ye unto all the congregation of Israel, saying, In the 10th day of this month they shall take to them every man a lamb, according to the house of their fathers, a lamb for an house. And if the household be too little for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next unto his house take it according to the number of the souls. Every man according to his eating shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You shall take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. And the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it in the evening. And they shall take of the blood and strike it on the two side posts and on the upper doorpost of the houses, wherein they shall eat it. And they shall eat the flesh in that night, roast with fire and unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Eat not of it raw, nor sodden at all with water, but roast with fire, his head with his legs, and with the purtenance thereof. And ye shall let nothing of it remain until the morning, and that which remaineth of it until the morning ye shall burn with fire. And thus shall ye eat it, with your loins girded, your shoes on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and ye shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt this night, and will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. And the blood shall be to you for a token upon the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. And the plague shall not be upon you to destroy you when I smite the land of Egypt. And this day shall be unto you for a memorial, and ye shall keep it a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. Ye shall keep it a feast by an ordinance forever. 7 days shall ye eat unleavened bread. Even the first day you shall put away leaven out of your houses. For whosoever eateth leavened bread from the first day until the 7th day, that soul shall be cut off from Israel. And in the first day there shall be an holy convocation, and in the 7th day there shall be an holy convocation to you. No manner of work shall be done in them, save that which every man must eat, that only may be done of you. And ye shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for in this selfsame day have I brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore shall ye observe this day in your generations by an ordinance forever. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at even, ye shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at even. 7 days shall there be no leaven found in your houses. For whosoever eateth that which is leavened, even that soul shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he be a stranger or born in the land. Ye shall eat nothing leavened, in all your habitations shall ye eat unleavened bread. Then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said unto them, Draw out and take you a lamb according to your families, and kill the Passover. You shall take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and strike the lintel and the two side posts with the blood that is in the basin. And none of you shall go out at the door of his house until the morning. For the Lord will pass through to smite the Egyptians. And when he seeth the blood upon the lintel and on the two side posts, the Lord will pass over the door, and will not suffer the destroyer to come in unto your houses to smite you. Ye shall observe this thing for an ordinance to thee and to thy sons forever. And it shall come to pass, when ye be come to the land which the Lord will give you, according as he hath promised, that ye shall keep this service. And it shall come to pass, when your children shall say unto you, What mean ye by this service? That ye shall say, It is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt, when he smote the Egyptians and delivered our houses. And the people bowed the head and worshipped. And the children of Israel went away and did as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, so did they. So the fourth commandment of the commission, or the fourth command of the commission, is to teach the baptized disciples in the church to observe everything Jesus commanded. And in the last message, we focused on the priority of the teaching of God's word to the congregation. So, Paul spoke of God's design in Jesus giving pastors and teachers to his churches for the purpose of maturing the saints. That's in Ephesians chapter number 4 that we looked at several messages ago. Now, as we saw in the previous message, there can be a lot of busy work involved in being a member of a church. And you can think of places like Acts chapter number 6 and how the apostles led the church there to select deacons that they could put over the money and the resources and such, dealing with the distribution of food to the poor widows in their midst. We know that churches regularly met for meals. We read about that in the New Testament in the first and in the first century. Otherwise, we have record of that. We read of different men and women that hosted churches in their houses or hosted traveling saints and missionaries like Paul. Churches today typically have some sort of property or not. They may not, but they typically have some sort of property, whether it's rented or owned. And the churches in the first few centuries did not have that. But whether churches have that or not, there's always going to be some busy work that is necessary just in the life of a congregation. So the point of emphasizing teaching and discipleship is not to say that those things are unimportant. It's rather to remind us that we don't want to miss the point of why we're doing the busy work that we're doing. We don't want to displace the priority of the teaching of the Word of God so that the busy work crowds out and overtakes or distracts from that. Now, going to Exodus in this message might seem like changing gears from studying the doctrine of the church that we have been doing, but it's not. This message falls under the category of what we are teaching disciples to observe. We've been talking about that last command of the commission, to teach them to observe all things that Jesus has commanded. And so obviously that's going to entail us understanding what are the all things, what are we taught to observe. Now, in our modern Gentile context, it may not seem that relevant to think about Passover or some of the other feasts of Israel, but it was very relevant in the first century in the New Testament. And a lot of times these things were addressed in the epistles and even in the book of Acts. Also, if you were raised in a Torah observant Jewish family and were converted to Jesus Christ, it'd be a very relevant question for you as well. Are you required to observe these feasts? And it really still is a relevant question for us today. What are we to observe? All right, so in this message, we want to consider the feasts, the festivals, those things commanded in the Old Testament. We're going to focus on the feast of Passover, not get into all the ins and outs of all the different feasts and festivals. But what we want to understand is the importance of these festivals in the life of Israel and consider whether or not churches in this age are required to observe those feasts. So what we have in Exodus chapter number 12, we have the first Passover. So this is verses 1 to 28, which we read at the beginning. And these verses give instructions for the first Passover. And one of the things that we obviously have to understand about the Passover is that the Passover was first an event. It was something that happened first. And it was something that happened in preparation for the 10th plague to come upon Egypt, the death of the firstborn, and also their departure, their exodus from the land of Egypt. And after it was an event that took place, then it was to be a recurring memorial feast of remembrance that was to be kept throughout their generations. And verse 2 here in chapter 12 shows us something of the importance of the Passover. It says in verse 2, "This month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you." So the Passover month, the month that They were delivered from the land of Egypt and from the bitter bondage that they were enslaved in there, that they were delivered to go out and to go to the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was to be the first month of the year for Israel. So it was then the beginning of the year. It was the beginning of their redemption from Egypt. It was really the beginning of Israel as a nation. This month began with the new moon. All right, so I gave you this handout. I want to look through and point out some things about the Hebrew calendar in the Old Testament, and even really this calendar here would have been what would have been held in the time of Christ. So there are some things added to it from just the Old Testament, and I adapted that mainly from Edersheim's book. I went through several different. If you have a study Bible or something at home, you may have some sort of a chart or something like that giving you these months. So this, you'll see the numbers there, and numbered 1 through 12, and you'll notice the different colors. That's about as snazzy as the graphics get on this. You'll notice the different colors because essentially the year for Israel consisted of two seasons. You had a dry season and you had a rainy season. And so the months that are noted in blue, this would be part of the rainy season, the wet season, and the months that are noted in red would be a part of the dry season. So as these instructions were given to Moses, they were to actually begin their year. They were going to begin to count their year from this would be the first month, and that's the month of Nisan. Now, as you go through there and you look at those names, sometimes you'll see different spellings of those names. Sometimes you'll see different names given for some of these months, like the month Abib. Sometimes it's mentioned in the Old Testament, or Nisan, as it later came to be called. So sometimes you'll see some differences, but generally the Old Testament seems to more say the first month, or the second month, or the seventh month, and so on. So you've got the numbers there. So the first month be the month of Nisan, and it was the time of the spring equinox, and it's corresponds roughly to the end of March or the beginning of April, where we are now, in fact. The first day of the month would be the new moon. Now these are noted on these months, and within Israel, there actually was a new moon feast every month except for in the seventh month, I believe. There was a new moon feast, and the new moon was what was to begin the new month. You also see the 14th day of the month. That was the preparation for the Passover and the Paschal service. And of course, is when the Passover lamb, was killed. On the 15th, the first day, is when it was eaten, and thereafter began the Feast of Unleavened Bread that lasted for 7 days. And then you can see the rest of some of the days there that are mentioned: the 14th day, or the 15th or 16th, the 21st, to close actually of that whole Passover time frame. So the time of Nisan was the time of the year as known as the latter rains. This is when they were getting the latter rains, getting close to the dry season. It was also the time of the barley harvest. So then you get to the second month, and again, you see the new moon starting on day one. It corresponds roughly to what we know as April or May. This is the time. You notice the Edersheim noticed there a second or a little Passover. Well, this was actually a provision in the law. So if all the males of Israel were required to observe and to keep the Passover, and if for some reason a male was ceremonially unclean and could not observe the Passover, then there was a provision in the law that they could observe a second Passover, which would happen on the second month or the next month after, exactly 30 days later. This would be the 15th of the second month of Iyar. So that's in Numbers chapter 9, verses 9 to 11, where that provision is given. So this was also the time of the latter rains. This is getting toward the end of the latter rains, also the time of the wheat harvest in Israel. So as we continue on, we have the third month, Sivan, corresponds to May or June. New moon feast, obviously. Significant about Sivan was you had the Feast of Pentecost. Now, I have 3 different feasts that are underlined on this chart. So you'll see the first one is Passover in the first month, and the next one is Pentecost in the third month. The next one will come up here in just a few. I underlined those because those are the primary feasts. Those are also known, later came to be known as the pilgrim feasts, because that was the time of pilgrimage to Jerusalem to observe them. All right, so that was when Pentecost was. This was the beginning of the dry season for Israel, and it was the time of the vine dressing, tending to the vineyards. Then we have the fourth month, Tammuz. And you see, this is an example of you see a fast here on the 17th day of Tammuz. And this is concerning the taking of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. Later on the 17th, taking of Jerusalem by Titus. So that was much later, even after the time of Jesus' time, and so on. So you can see that this calendar is more reflective of that first century, maybe late first century in Israel. There was into the dry season. It was the time of the ripening of the grapes and the figs and the olives, what were considered the summer fruits, and could also be a part of the early grape harvest, or the first fruits of the grapes. The fifth month thereof Av, corresponding to July or August, still the dry season. It was the primary time of the grape and the fig and the olive harvest, the summer fruits harvest. The sixth month, Elul, corresponding to August or September, still in the dry season. And it was a time of the processing of the grapes and the figs and the summer fruits that had been harvested. And then we get to the seventh month, which is significant history, and it is corresponds to our September or October. And you'll notice that Edersheim has this noted here as the beginning of the civil year, and this is something that can be somewhat confusing, because there are actually two new years within the Jewish calendar. The original New Year would be that of Nisan, and then this second New Year in September. The second New Year, it's not exactly certain when it began to be observed that way. It could have been a little prior to the time of Christ, and certainly by the second century it was being observed. It seems that it was most likely connected to agriculture and the time of the harvests and all of that sort of thing. And so the beginning of the new year, it is now in the seventh month is when the Jewish festival of Rosh Hashanah is observed. But you also notice there on the 15th day of the seventh month was the Feast of Tabernacles. And that New Year's feast that's mentioned, again, that's not something commanded in the law. The first day of the seventh month was a solemn Sabbath and feast of the Lord, but nothing about that New Year. But Feast of Tabernacles, which was that third and primary pilgrim feast. And so ultimately in the year, you had this cycle that repeated year after year after year. Then you had the sabbatical year and so on. But you had this cycle that would repeat. And from Nisan and the Passover to Tishri and the Feast of Tabernacles was essentially what was considered the festal cycle, because that's when you had Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, those three primary feasts that took place during that time. You get to the eighth month, that would be the corresponding to October and November, and the time of the beginning of the early rains. So now you're getting out of the dry season. Now you're getting into the early rains, the time of planting of grains and wheat and such. You get to the ninth month, November to December time frame, early rains, planting of grain. 10th month, December, January time frame, well into the rainy season now. Time of late planting for the early spring growth. The 11th month that you see there, corresponding there to January and February, again into the rainy season, the very late and last of the planting. And then you get to the 12th month, and this was the end of the year, which corresponds to our February or March. You can see that's when the fast of Esther is observed, the Purim, the Feast of Purim, which were obviously those came about after the time of Esther. Those were observed in the month of Adar. Well into the rainy season, almond trees began blooming. Citrus fruit is harvested. The flax harvest would come at the latter part of that time. All right, so that's just sort of a quick rundown to think about how that the life of Israel was structured, and how that it was structured around this particular calendar. Now, this calendar It was a lunar-based calendar. The new moon would begin the month. And it was also an agriculturally based calendar. And you had 12 months of 30 days each, essentially. They worked out to about like 29 and a half days or so. But in terms of solar time, this calendar for Israel only accounted for just under 355 days. And so there would be an extra month. There'd be another month added that would be referred to as a second Adar, and it would be added after the Adar and before Nisan that the next year would start. So you would have some years that had 13 months in them in the Jewish calendar. And in order to reconcile this lunar calendar with the solar and to keep on track, because what would happen if they didn't do that is eventually you would have months moving out of seasons. You would have winter months going into spring and spring months going into summer, and it would just keep moving along that way. So the way that they reconciled that and kept everything on track was by adding these Adars, and they had to do that. Sometimes it's referred to as a Jewish leap year, a 13-month year, and they could not fall on a sabbatical year when they were keeping track of that. So what the adjustment would be was out of a 19-year span, they had to get an extra 7 months in there in order to reconcile to the solar calendar, and that is how that they did that. But the point of just looking over this calendar and just trying to point out some of the days and some of these feasts and festivals, and you, aside from things like weekly Sabbath and morning and evening offerings and things, you realize that the life of Israel was really structured around what could be called a liturgical calendar. They had these various feasts and festivals and regular observances aside from other offerings and sacrifices and things that were going on. Now, one of the things about Passover is that Passover was considered the primary feast. This was the major feast of their year. It would start off their year and this festal cycle every year with Passover and Pentecost and Tabernacles. So it was a very important part of their life. And in other words, the agriculture and the agriculture was also connected to the feasts, like the Feast of Pentecost, which was an ingathering feast, and so on. So these harvests and all of these things were also involved and tied together. So you can see how that all of their life was built around these various feasts and festivals that they were to observe. So let's just look at a few particulars here pertaining to the Passover in Exodus chapter number 12. So verses 3 to 23 essentially are giving the instructions for this Passover to be observed. Now, again, this was the original Passover event. This was when they were going to be taken out of Egypt. The Lord was going to pass through and was going to kill all the firstborn where the blood wasn't found and so on. And so there are some things about this Passover that obviously would not carry over to the memorial, like the eventually the blood on the doorpost and all of that sort of thing. Some of the various things involved here wouldn't carry over. Passover was followed then by a 7-day feast of unleavened bread. And the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread were so connected, so closely connected, that really that whole 8-day time came to be referred to as Passover. So when you have a reference to Passover, it can be referring to the actual lamb that was going to be slain, because sometimes you'll see reference to the killing of the Passover. And so it's referring particularly to the lamb that was slain. Sometimes you'll see a reference to Passover, and it could be to the Passover meal that was eaten after the lamb was slain. Or you'll see a reference to Passover, and it could be a reference to this whole time frame or to the Feast of Unleavened Bread, any of these other things. So the whole time came to be referred to as Passover, and particularly in Jesus' day. And you'll see that pop up in some of the Gospels. And when we, not in this message, but when we get further along, looking at the correlation between the Passover and the Lord's Supper and all of that, we'll see some of those things. So it came to identify this whole time period. And when we look at verses a little later, like verses 24 to 27. And ye shall observe this thing for an ordinance to thee and to thy sons forever. And it shall come to pass when ye come to the land which the Lord will give you, according as he hath promised, that ye shall keep this service. And it shall come to pass when your children shall say unto you, what mean ye by this service? That ye shall say, it is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt, when he smote the Egyptians and delivered our houses. And the people bowed the head and worshiped. So here we're seeing instructions for the memorial observance of this Passover. We go on a little later in the chapter, verses 43 to 49. And the Lord said unto Moses and Aaron, this is the ordinance of the Passover. There shall no stranger eat thereof, but every man's servant that is bought for money, when thou hast circumcised him, then shall he eat thereof. A foreigner and a hired servant shall not eat thereof. In one house shall it be eaten. Thou shalt not carry forth aught of the flesh abroad out of the house, neither shall you break a bone thereof. All the congregation of Israel shall keep it. And when a stranger shall sojourn with thee and will keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised. Then let him come near and keep it, and he shall be as one that is born in the land. For no uncircumcised person shall eat thereof. One law shall be to him that is homeborn and unto the stranger that sojourneth among you. So you can see, even at the time in relation to this first Passover event, that there were instructions that were being given for the way that this Passover was to be kept as a memorial feast thereafter among all of their generations. Now, after this original first Passover event, the first memorial celebration of the Passover was actually the second year after the Exodus, and that's recorded in Numbers chapter 9 and verse number 15. And that would have been in the wilderness of Sinai when that was observed. And it was not celebrated again until Israel reached the promised land, and they were in the plains of Jericho in Joshua chapter 5, verse number 10. So you have like a 40-year time span when it wasn't observed again. After that, the mentions of the celebration of Passover are relatively few. We have a mention of one time during Solomon's reign. That's 2 Chronicles chapter 8, verse 13. One time during the reign of Hezekiah, 2 Chronicles chapter 30 and verse 15. One time during the reign of Josiah, 2 Kings chapter 23 and verse number 21. And one time after the return from Babylon in Ezra's time, Ezra chapter 6 and verse number 19. These are the only references to the public celebration and observance of the Passover taking place. We, of course, have references to the Passover, and sometimes when you read in the prophets, you'll have references where the prophets are condemning the people for profaning the Passover and things like that. So it seems reasonable to see that the Passover continued to be observed, but we just don't have a lot of mentions of it being observed after these instances of it being instituted. So after that, Israel was settled in the land, and God chose Jerusalem as the place of his name. Then the Passover was one of the pilgrim feasts, where all the males of Israel were required to go to Jerusalem for the feast and to offer the required sacrifices and such. So this would happen 3 times a year: Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, the Passover itself consisted of a meal of remembrance. We can read about that here beginning at verse number 8. And they shall eat the flesh. This is of the lamb. The lamb in verse 5, your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You shall take it out from the sheep or from the goats. Then it will be killed and the blood taken. It says verse 8, they shall eat the flesh in that night, roast with fire and unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Eat not of it raw, nor sodden it all with water, but roast with fire his head, with his legs, and with the purtenance thereof. You shall let nothing of it remain until the morning, and that which remaineth of it until the morning you shall burn with fire. So the Passover, the observance of the Passover itself, consisted of the slaying of the Passover lamb that had to be a male of the first year without any blemish. And then it was to be eaten having been roasted with fire, not boiled or anything. It was to be eaten with bitter herbs. And the bitter herbs was to remind them of the bitter bondage in Egypt that they were subjected to. It was to be eaten with unleavened bread. Now, unleavened bread reminded them of their haste in departure. So in chapter 12 here in verse number 34, for instance, it says, "And the people took their dough before it was leavened, and their kneading troughs, being bound up in their clothes upon their shoulders." Verse 39 says, "And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough, which they brought forth out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were thrust out of Egypt and could not tarry, neither had they prepared for themselves any victuals." So um, the unleavened bread was to remind them of their departure in haste. Essentially, they didn't have time to have bread to rise and to do all of those things. They made unleavened bread. Also, their posture and their attire for that meal reminded them of their haste. Verse number 11 says, "And thus shall ye eat it, with your loins girded, your shoes on your feet, your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover." Now, bread that was leavened was typically leavened from a starter. And so unleavened bread also reminded them of the break with their life in Egypt, their break and their new life in the promised land that they were looking forward to. Now, the Passover was indeed codified in the Old Covenant law, and to not celebrate the Passover, which we've already read how it was required of all the congregation of Israel. To not celebrate it meant to be cut off from Israel and disinherited from the land of promise. Numbers chapter 9, verses 9 to 14. "And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, If any man of you or of your posterity shall be unclean by reason of a dead body, or be in a journey afar off, yet he shall keep the Passover unto the Lord. The 14th day of the second month at even they shall keep it, and eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall leave none of it unto the morning, nor break any bone of it. According to all the ordinances of the Passover, they shall keep it. But the man that is clean and is not in a journey, and forbeareth to keep the Passover, even the same soul shall be cut off from among his people, because he brought not the offering of the Lord in his appointed season, and that man shall bear his sin. And if a stranger shall sojourn among you, and will keep the Passover unto the Lord, according to the ordinance of the Passover, and according to the manner thereof, so shall he do. You shall have one ordinance both for the stranger and for him that was born in the land." So this was the provision that I was talking about a little bit earlier. There was a provision made. If a man was ceremonially unclean, or if for some reason he was away and could not physically make it for the observance of the Passover, then they had to observe what was called the second Passover, or sometimes the little Passover. That would be in the next month, 1 month later. But you see that if a man did not do that, so verse number 13 says that if a man was ceremonially clean so that he could eat the Passover, and he wasn't on a journey so that he was just providentially hindered from being able to attend and observe, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. He shall bear his sin. In other words, he would be excommunicated from the nation of Israel, and he would be disinherited from the land. In other words, he would become like a Gentile. He'd become like a pagan and have no part or lot amongst the children of Jacob. So, as we look at this feast of Passover, we can see how important that this feast was. It was something that gave structure to their entire year. Their lives were centered around these observances that they were commanded, and it was even intertwined with agriculture and various aspects of their life in that regard. Not only that, it was commanded that it was to be observed, and those who did not observe it, well, they would suffer essentially what would be like a death sentence. It's a judgment sentence. They'd be cut off from the people and disinherited from the land. In other words, they would not be saved from the wrath of God. They would not inherit the kingdom of God. So this is how important that the Passover was. And that brings us now to our question. When Jesus said that we are to teach all things that he has commanded, observe all things that he has commanded, should churches observe the Passover or any of these other feasts for that matter? But again, just focusing on the Passover. Well, it was obviously important in the life of Israel. And when we look at passages like Acts chapter number 18 and verse 21 and Acts chapter number 20 and verse number 6, well, we can see that Paul continued to observe these feasts after that he was converted to Jesus Christ. So, should we observe them? And did Paul require that of others? Well, the answer to that is no. We should not observe the feast of Passover. We are not required to observe the feast of Passover or any of the other feasts of the Old Covenant. And we have a few reasons for that. Maybe the prime one to look at would be in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verses 7 to 8, where Paul wrote, "Purge out therefore the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, even as you are unleavened. For even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. Therefore let us keep the feast, not with the old leaven, neither with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth." What Paul says very simply there is that Jesus Christ has fulfilled the Passover. He is our Passover. He is the Passover lamb that was slain. He has fulfilled the Passover for us. And when he talks about keeping the feast, I don't believe that he's referring to keeping the Jewish feast of Passover, but rather referring to the Lord's Supper that he would talk about later in 1 Corinthians. Of course, we know the context there in 1 Corinthians chapter number 5, and that was the disciplinary action against that man that was living in unrepentant sin in the congregation. So for one, we're not observing Passover or these other feasts today because Christ has fulfilled those things. New covenant Christians, in fact, Paul said, have died to the law and are not under it. Romans chapter 7, verse 4, "Wherefore, my brethren, ye also are become dead to the law by the body of Christ, that ye should be married to another, even to him who is raised from the dead, that we should bring forth fruit unto God." Romans 6:14 says, "For sin shall not have dominion over you, for you're not under law, but under grace." Another reason that we would give is that these observances were only shadows of the reality in Jesus Christ. The whole argument of the book of Hebrews is why would you want to go back to the shadow when we have the substance? Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 to 17, Paul wrote, "Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of an holy day or of the new moon or of the Sabbath days, which are a shadow of things to come, but the body is of Christ." And we could go on along this line, but already in this series, we have talked about the relationship that we Christians today have to the Old Covenant law and so on. And really, all of that applies just as much when we are thinking about the feast and the festivals of the Old Covenant law. And no, we're not to observe those things. Paul, being a Jew, did not observe those things out of requirement. In fact, Paul said those that were observing them out of requirement were those that he called weak. They were of weak consciences. They had not properly matured and understood. So Paul didn't observe it out of a requirement, but he observed it in sort of in his Jewishness and in opening that door and maintaining that connection with his kinspeople. And that certainly would be even understandable in today for someone to be doing that in that nature, having grown up in that and having that Jewish family and what have you. That would be understandable. But it is not required, and it ought not to be observed. I believe if you think about Timothy and Titus, Timothy had Jewish descent, and Paul had him circumcised in order to be able to have an opening to speak to the Jews. Titus, who was fully a Gentile, he refused to have circumcised. So I would think we would follow that same principle, again, that today as Gentiles and as churches, even churches with Jewish members, we should not be observing the feast of Passover or any of these other feasts. And I might also add that those that are or try to really aren't doing it according to the law anyway. But that's sort of another issue. So if churches should not observe fasts and feasts of the old covenant, and Paul clearly refers to those things in Colossians and Romans, letter to the Corinthians. Well, how does that relate to the Lord's Supper and what churches should be observing? If we are to teach disciples to observe all things that Christ has commanded. Well, that's what we're going to get to in the messages after this, considering the relationship of the Passover to the Lord's Supper and what it is that we as churches are to observe. But that's all of our message for this evening. So we will close with a hymn.